Welcome to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures, with thought leader and award-winning author Yvette Bethel. This podcast provides you with insights and ideas you can use to reinvent your culture through trust and the principles of interconnectivity, flow, and balance. At a time when the world is rewriting the rules of work, traditional leadership practices are not enough. It's time to perceive persistent challenges through a new lens. It's time to evolve.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us today as I'm here with Yvette Bethel, very good friend of mine, long time colleague in the work that we do. If you haven't seen one of these before, I'm Steve Goodner. I founded EQ Fit, which is focused around consulting, coaching, organizational development, leadership development, psychometric assessments, and all of that. Really, the purpose of that in one line is equipping people to prosper. Yvette, tell people about you.
I have a consulting company, and I started out with HR and morphed into culture, human ecosystems, trust, and I do specialized training in the areas where I've researched, especially around human ecosystems and leadership in that context and trust. I'm based in the Bahamas.
Yes, and I'm busy. Probably in January or February.
That's a good time to come.
And let me, before I get into what we're going to focus on today, if you have comments, questions, ideas, thoughts, anything, this is interactive. So please go into the chat. Feel free to enter those things. And we would love to get to your questions or your thoughts as we go through this process today. I remember when you shared your book with me, Interconnectivity, Flow, and Balance. And I guess in all of the work that I had done, I had never thought about that kind of approach, living systems approach to organizations. And it's fascinating to me. What I want to start with is we talk a lot about culture in what we do. What are the core elements? When we think about culture, we think about leaders really set the tone for the culture. And today's focus is really about what's going on within organizations. So the first question that I've got here is, what are the core elements leaders often overlook and they're trying to shape or transform their organizational culture?
There's so many. I think I'll share a few that I come across consistently. One is that overlook themselves as the primary architects. So whatever they complain about is something that they did or didn't do that kind of put it in place. And then it reinforced it. One of the things that I look for is something that I call cultural anchors. And so they not only put it in place, and sometimes their intention is quite different, but they put it in place and then it gets anchored through themselves and or others. That's one thing that they overlook, that their primary role, because the culture often starts out when it's a small company with 4 or 5 people working, it's an extension of the owner. And then it expands from there, but it's still an extension of the owner. That's number one. I think the other thing that I caution leaders about is culture is not an HR initiative. While HR has an important role to play, culture is everybody's business. And the business has to own a cultural transformation, not HR. HR will own its part in that transformation. Really, the business needs to own it. They need to take ownership and plan and run it because it's beyond HR. You have to get into structures, you have to get into systems, you have to get into technology, all kinds of things. And if you have HR running it, there'll be some limitation, not that people are limited, but that's not their role.
Can I interject something quickly? You really brought to mind for me a book I read several years ago called An Everyone Culture, and Bradley, I believe it was. And one of the things they said in there that really struck me and resonates as you say this is organizations get the culture they tolerate.
That's it.
And what you're saying, I think, is that actually is multidimensional across the entire organization.
That's right. In fact, since you brought that up, I'll take my next point, the third point from that direction, which is core values. Because there's a tolerance that happens with the core values. Also, there are espoused core values and then there are actual ones. And a lot of times leaders are caught up with the espoused ones, thinking that those are the actual core values that are operationalized. But in reality, it could be all kinds of things, all kinds of values that become core to the organization because people come in, they have their own ideas, they have their own experience of other cultures, and they bring these things in and start to morph the values in different ways. So that's why the owner is the primary architect, but then you can have other powerful architects built within.
I like the way you say that. I use aspirational values versus applicational values. And when I'm working with an organization, I ask them what their values are. But the second question is always, are those aspirational or applicational?
What's that?
How I see them play out every day in the workplace. Go ahead.
Most times they're not aware of the actual values. It's like these are unwritten rules, these are unwritten values that people just adopt automatically through pressure and tensions. They may not have language for it in some cases, or it might just be like a joke. People just make a joke about it at work, but it's actually a value.
Isn't that something? Are you ready to move on to the next question?
Yeah.
Okay. Let me ask you this. In your book, and this is when we get back to your book, and I would highly recommend it if you haven't read it. It is a unique insight. It's called Interconnectivity, Flow, and Balance, and Yvette's name is right there. So you can look her up on Amazon under her. And she has several books, by the way, and she is a best-selling author. In your book, Interconnectivity, Flow, and Balance, help us understand what each of those mean and how do they play out in what we're talking about today?
Sure. I think to start with, interconnectivity, flow, and balance, those are three natural laws that operate within all living ecosystems. So whether we're in nature or in the boardroom, in a company, the same natural laws apply. The interesting thing that I find about it is that you can use those natural laws, interconnectivity, flow, and balance for good, the greater good, or they can be mutated into something that's corrupt. And regardless of what you're using them for, the same laws are still operationalized. It's just like you're running a system in your computer, the operating system, and it's running all of the programs. It doesn't change no matter which program you run, and that's the way these three laws operate within organizations. They don't change. All you do is put different programming, different kinds of approaches into the business. So to answer the question, after giving you a little bit of a context, interconnectivity has to do with how people connect within an organization, a group, or family. And that is not limited to connecting with people. People connect with policies in different ways. They connect with groups of people like leaders or a department. They connect. So there's a side to interconnectivity where you're connecting with something alive, and then there's something abiotic, which happens in nature as well. I take a look at the biotic and abiotic living and non-living connections because they all come together, and a lot of times leaders overlook the non-living ones. For example, you may have a certain policy, but people don't relate to the policy the way that you expect. They ignore it. They override it. This is them relating or not relating in this case. And it gives you information, and it does impact other parts of the model like flow. Flow gives you insight into how the organization is working. And when things are flowing well enough, the tensions that come out of flow, they modulate, but they can be modulated, but certainly they're not creating a challenge in the organization. And then you have some tensions that come out of flows. For example, when you have layers of corruption operationalized within the system, within your organizational system, you have subsystems of corruption. Then that creates layers of drag on the system for me to be addressed.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So why do you emphasize looking at culture from a systemic perspective rather than focusing solely on, say, individual behaviors or isolated events?
I learned a while ago that when I was working with behavioral change coaching and training and things like that, I found that there was something going on in the organization that was anchoring the behavior, nothing to do with training and coaching, but it re-anchored the old behavior, even though the person sincerely wanted to change. I realized that the structures and systems were anchoring the behaviors. And that example that I gave you is part of a leadership system where they know there's a corruption going on there. Also, from a systemic perspective, it allows you to be more flexible and controlling. And if you use the model in the way that I propose in the book, you can use it for flexibility, agility, innovation. It facilitates agility and engagement because people now can express themselves because the model itself is anchored in trust. A lot of control models anchor themselves in loyalty, and that creates a certain mutation in the system. But when its trust breaks down power, especially if it's centralized, it actually diffuses it, causes people to take ownership and rely on each other a lot more than they would without it. So it's the trust in the IB model, interconnectivity flow and balance model, that really differentiates it because trust has a magical and powerful impact on how people connect.
And this may be a lot for people to take in at first glance, but what I sense you saying is within any organization, there are these living systems that we have to be aware of what they are, how they're impacting individuals, leaders, teams in the organization as a whole, and getting into your book and wrapping your arms around a process that is a more intentional way. Instead of that, organizations get the culture they tolerate thing. It's a more intentional designed approach.
That's it.
Right.
That's it.
Okay.
And that's why I focus on the primary architect, because this whole thing is about design and being really deliberate about what it is that you aim to create. So having a vision for it, and with a lot of my clients, we actually develop a culture code, which takes the core values and then defines them the way the organization wants them defined. What is it that they want to see? And so they walk away with a visual of what they're going to tolerate, as you put it, and what they won't tolerate. Some of the very first, I think the one that was the very first one that I ran, I forget who it was. Netflix? I think it was a Netflix deck. That's the very first one. And it said that we don't tolerate high-performing bullies or something along those lines, things like that. But it also really clearly defined in conversational language what it is that they want the culture to look like.
Good.
Based on the values.
So let's turn to the darker side for a minute here and a little bit about corruption. first, I'm going to ask you a question. Just how would you define corruption in organizations?
I have a working definition, I'll put it that way, but I see it as an abuse of entrusted power for personal gain. And because it's systemic, I would go on to say that it can lead to intentional and unintended compliance with a larger counter agenda. People start off at the personal level, but then it feeds into something. So corruption is actually, at the individual level, is actually a feeder system into a larger system.
Interesting. And I remember something, Yvette, you told me several years ago that has stuck with me for all this time. You said, and I'm paraphrasing, but it was something like loyalty outside of a trust foundation is critical.
Yes.
Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
That's a form of, in fact, to me, that's a form of corruption, because then what happens is this relationship that's built, that's not on a firm foundation. It's based on ambition and career goals and not relating to a person. So it can be transactional. It can be many things other than real.
So let me ask this. Leaders need to be able to identify corruption in the workplace, in their culture. What are the subtle signs leaders often miss that indicate that a culture might be fostering unethical behavior or some form of corruption?
There are a lot of signs that are easy to miss. One is silence, when there should be some kind of tension. And people are just being silent. Same people getting opportunities all the time. What that is, they're creating a circle of people that are probably benefiting together. Corruption in most cases takes multiple people because it's systemic, and they need people at different points in the system where the system is vulnerable to be on board with it so that they can help cover up. So the same people that get opportunities, it's easy to place them in the system at vulnerable points so that they can cover up.
Is that a form of favoritism?
Yeah.
Talking about?
Yeah. Favoritism, cronyism, nepotism. You have top performers who abuse their power because they're favorites, because they're performing, but then they talk to people like dirt. And then you get people justifying things. Corruption starts as something different. It might have a noble cause. And then over time, it morphs.
So let's look now at what role does organizational violence or fear play in sustaining systems of corruption or dysfunction? And how can they even address that?
Organizational silence, to me, is a system. And with corruption, there are multiple systems at play. So you have the silence or the cover-ups. You have an economic system in some organizations where there's theft, embezzlement, bribery, whatever. And then you have corrupt leadership systems where they have different norms and they behave in certain ways that support all of this, favoritism and other things, and on power. So to me, all of the systems interlock and work together in one way. Although most companies have most of the systems in play, it all comes together a bit differently with a different theme. Silence is one of the systems, and that comes through a lack of people being willing to blow the whistle. There's no policy to protect them, things like that. It's needed, and people threaten each other to keep the silence going. They say things like, you better keep your mouth shut. Or anyway,
I may say it in joking, but there's truth in jest.
That's right.
There's a lot of truth in that joking.
And people know when there's truth, when they really mean it. People get silenced in ways, stay in your lane. You have limited meetings or opportunities to contribute to change. It's part of the bigger system. It's a subsystem of the bigger corrupt system.
Wow. It's almost like when people do those kinds of things, they're putting a cap or a ceiling on other people and on what they can accomplish or what could be. And that, just from the recent Gallup survey I was looking at, I mean, our engagement levels are down again. And the worst measure was leader manager engagement is at 27%. That's 1 in 4. And what is shocking to me about that is no wonder employee engagement levels are down. And it just makes me wonder how much of this corruption is just inherent in so many different organizations. And not corruption. I'm not saying corruption for anybody listening. I'm not saying from an evil perspective. I'm saying just from a practice perspective. Too busy. I wish I had $1 for every time I heard that. We're too busy because we're tired by now, if that were the case. But that's a challenge.
And that statement there leads to corruption. And it's not a corruption it could lead to economic corruption, but it leads to information corruption because now you're blocking things. And too busy is also a sign, back to your previous question, that there's some corruption happening. Which is just corruption from my perspective is a mutation as well.
Interesting, because you were saying whether it's in nature or wherever, living systems, we know what mutations do. And for those who don't know this about me, I don't know that I've ever shared this. When I was in college, I was pre-med and then I switched to straight sciences. So I came out with degrees in chemistry and biology and focused more on neuroscience and those areas. But here's what I know about mutations. They're 99.99% fatal. No different here.
I'll put it this way. Mutations that are not deliberate and planned, because a mutation is a change. Some of them are self-driven, and some of them are more deliberate and intentional, and sometimes they work out, and then sometimes they lead to the death of the organization.
Yeah. So give us an example. Give us a case study and anonymize it for us. You don't need to share names or anything, but give us a picture into an organization that you worked with, that you were able to help them transform, and you feel good about that experience.
Because I live in the Bahamas, we have less than 500,000 people here in the whole country. It's very difficult for me to share specifics. What I will do is share kinds of things that I come across more often. And I do sign confidentiality and any clauses and rulings. So what I will do is share like a simple case, which is something that we just talked about, and then that I see often, and then a more complex one, which is a composite of different cases. From a simple perspective, we talked about just now how information, people say, I'm too busy. That boils down to a form of information corruption. Because when people say, I'm too busy, and someone comes to them, their peers come to them and they need help, they're too busy. The peer needs information to serve another client, but because that person feels that their priorities are more important because of maybe some other issues around performance management systems that don't allow for supporting each other, they can get away with it. And what it does is it starts to grind to a halt productivity, because now you have multiple bottlenecks in different places, which is being caused by the corruption or the mutation, I'm too busy. But if everybody in the organization is saying, I'm too busy, then there's a deep issue because that's connected to information corruption, leadership corruption, power, communication gets corrupted. And in some cases, I'm too busy could cover up economic corruption, whereas they're just like covering up something else that's going on. So none of these systems have one thing going. That's a simplified version. At a more complex level, I've seen situations where you have multiple layers of economic corruption because it was allowed to infiltrate in one way. People took advantage of, back to your point, the silencing and turning a blind eye to things. And you have multiple departments allowing corruption to infiltrate. The company is losing money, while at the same time, you have low transparency. You have information corruption as well, and leadership corruption, because somebody's holding it in place and turning a blind eye.
And everything you're saying is so valuable because the other side of that coin is what you cannot do because of this corruption we're talking about. You cannot be more agile. You cannot have a higher level of competitive advantage in the marketplace because it just sounds like it's very individual focused, internal focus, self-focus.
That's right.
Instead of team effort or organizational, it's an inward drawing instead of an outward flowing.
That's right. And it's the opposite of interconnectivity. It's what they're doing is they're becoming more and more self-agenda driven. And then that causes mutations. And you can't always predict what mutations come out of that. There's everybody who cares about. It's every man for himself kind of thing. So the mutation can be a little bit unpredictable at times.
Okay. So let's kind of transition here into practical cultural transformation. Where should leaders start if they realize some of this is going on? They may have some embedded harmful systems or cultural practices that are not helping, they're actually harming. What is a practical first step?
I always run some kind of diagnostic first to understand what's going on. And then you need some kinds of audits to prove it. Because people will share with you, but you actually need to prove that these things are happening. And once you're clear, you have to understand that it's not only about getting rid of bad actors. You really have to dig into the system. Once you might get rid of a few of the bad actors, but there's some that you may not have found out about. And they can operationalize, they can take over the system because it's already in play. So you also need to dismantle the system, and that's through incentives for meritocracy, setting budgets and having some procurement processes in place, changing how you make decisions. Like everything needs to be looked at because all of those things, well, I call it corruption creep. It creeps.
Absolutely. And I love what you're saying here, Yvette, because it's exactly the same stuff I believe. We need to come from a data-driven approach to these human dynamics, to the things that we're talking about, because if you don't come from a data-driven approach, you're just guessing. And forgive the term, you're shooting in the dark and hoping you hit something.
And we're dealing with people's lives. So I think the organization has a responsibility, if they didn't already have the controls in place, to take a deep look and understand from a more factual basis what's happening, because people will tell you what's going on, but certainly you need to prove it before you take action. Some people just pull the trigger. I told him, and that's it might be the right decision because it was true, but then you don't know that.
So let's take that to the next level. What are some effective ways to engage employees at every level while we're trying to shift to a healthier organizational culture?
I think I always take a multi-layered approach to engaging. And that what's key to all of this is for the owner or the CEO or managing director to take ownership as the architect or primary architect. They don't have to be the only one, because you can have other senior members of the team that contribute to that. Then you have management. Their role is to become role models and champions and live. They need to live the core values.
I'm going to show that. I love that comment. How would you answer that question?
Word recommendations to that. Okay. Yeah, it does limit trust. I do several different things, but I always found one thing works the best for me. I used to do assessments, but many assessments don't pick up on things like corruption that might be pervasive. Now, it'll give you some hints that something is going on that people are upset about, but it won't zero in. I learned in statistical work is exploratory and explanatory. And so I use focus groups and interviews. Interviews just give me so much information. It's mind-blowing because they're in a safe space. There are no names being provided about who said what. And if anything's on their mind, in many cases, they just talk without me asking a single question. And that's when you start to get what's really going on in the organization. You cut through all of the manufactured questions and just let it flow. Because what's really on their minds and what's really bothering them will come out first. And if it's corruption, it's going to come out first. It's going to come out some in different ways. Like sometimes you have to understand how the system works to understand that this is an indicator of corruption. For example, one big indicator is when people are saying they're underpaid. No, hang on. I know you're going to laugh because everybody says that.
Everybody says it, right?
But there are instances where that leads to corruption. And so you have to look now at the other systems to understand if they're just like complaining or this is actually something that's hurtful to the company because they're getting the money another way.
So as leaders are trying to make these changes in culture to get to a healthier place, what are some of the common mistakes that leaders may make, and how can they avoid those?
I think when it comes to corruption, I think the leaders need to keep their finger on the pulse of the transformation and not try to delegate, because it's because of the nature of corruption with the creep that I just talked about. It can creep back to what it was because systems have a way of trying to get back to a comfort zone on their own.
Oh.
So it's almost like an elastic feature. So if it's delegated and the people that were running the rackets, the scams or whatever, if they are still in the system, of course, there won't be any big change. Delegation is a big mistake, especially because of how systems try to protect themselves. And corruption is a system that will protect itself. People have vested interests in them.
That really resonates with me in the habit transformation work that I do with people like leaders and owners of organizations. When you say things tend to go back to the way they were, it's like breaking a bad habit. It's transforming a counterproductive habit into a more productive habit. What you're saying is you're doing that on an organizational basis.
It's a macro level transformation. And so you have to be mindful that it will seek a comfort zone. And if that comfort zone is corruption, it'll seek that.
Were there other mistakes leaders make that you'd like to mention?
One that I see is they expect everyone else to change, and that's like everywhere. But that's such a big thing, and everybody's waiting for them to change. So it's like a Mexican standoff kind of thing.
I have a quick story I'll share
Mhm.
about that. Big culture change project 10 years ago, I started and got in with the owner. And this is a very driven individual, very factual engineer type. And he was telling me about all the problems with his people and they couldn't do this and they can't do this and they can't do this. And I said, you do know that the fish rods from the head down.
Yeah, yeah.
He goes, what word? He finds me kind of, oh, yes, exactly. He finally went, wait a minute.
Did you just say something about reading?
Hearts to heart at the top. I think that transformation has got to start at the top, and it's got to start from the inside out, I think.
Start and be sustained. You can't just launch it and leave it either. That's another mistake.
That's great. Okay, so now you mentioned trust several times. So I'd like to kind of transition and ask you, although we're focused on a much broader topic here than just trust, where does trust fit in to this values-based framework that's interconnectivity, flow, and balance?
Trust is the pillar for the framework. That's why I call it the pillar of trust. Trust is one of the highest quality connective factors. Trust and love. Those are the two highest qualities. People don't necessarily need to love each other at work, but for things to work properly, they need to trust each other more. And so trust came into the systems part of what I do because it actually infuses integrity into the systems and structures. It builds the emotional quotient because when people feel psychologically unsafe, then the trust declines and then that impacts the business. And it also supports collaboration. Now, I want to say this because you can have non-trust based, high performing organizations. Then some things start to happen. It really wears people out. It disengages people. They get burnt out, disengaged because they're being treated like transactions. It becomes more and more transactional, and they end up moving on in some cases. And in some cases, they stay. But you can build better engagement with the whole team as opposed to just the top performers with trust because you can get more out of them synergistically.
It's funny you said that because my blog article and podcast episode this week is about why are managers burning out? Why are leaders burning out? It starts with disengagement. Burnout is very serious. Thank you for sharing that. So what specific systems or processes help build or reinforce trust within a broader cultural transformation?
I think every time I work on trust building, every organization is different, but I use the same pillar of trust. I focus on different things depending on what's absent. So if there's not a lot of emotional intelligence in one organization and people just feel unsafe doing things, I zoom in on that. If nobody cares about each other, I zoom in on the EQ and what we call the we disposition. If there's low integrity, then you have to zoom in on that. If there's corruption, the integrity needs to be addressed. Definitely, whether it's economic or not.
And I know for a fact, but share with everybody else, you've actually created an assessment for this.
Yes, I have. We have two now, but the trust style inventory, that one is a validated assessment. And I created it with 6 seconds. And what it does is it helps you to understand your style, your approach to trust. It does not provide you with a trustworthiness score because we found that scores make people feel unsafe. And they tended to exaggerate how trustworthy they are.
Sure we not.
If everybody got like 100%. We did a literature review to understand what was going on, and the obvious came out that people feel unsafe about trust assessments. And so the literature review revealed that they lie. They will lie so that they don't come out as being seen as not trustworthy, because that could impact their career.
Trust is such a overused word that when you and I talk about trust, we think about it within a very specific context and how trust touches everything. And I think that's such an important piece of information. You bet we're not going to have time today to go really deeply into this. Would you do me a favor? Would you put your email address into the chat? So if anybody would like to have a connection with you, that you could do that and just reach out to Yvette directly. And I can tell everybody as she's doing that I have become certified in the trust style inventory. I have used it. It's very effective, specifically about how you approach trust. And that's so important, because this way, if you know that across a team of people, answer that question for us, Yvette. If everybody in a team, including the leader, took the trust style inventory, what would that do for them?
Well, so the two approaches you can take. There are two approaches you can take. What it does for the individual is it helps them to see themselves more clearly and how they approach trust. So the great thing about the assessment is it shows you which style you rely on, but the styles don't define you. Because trust is situational, you never trust the same way in every situation. So what it does is it shows what you rely on so that you can start to think about, maybe I shouldn't use this style in this situation. Maybe another style will help me to come across as more trustworthy so that I can get this work done or build this relationship. At that level, it's important as an individual tool. At a collective level or at the team level, the tool can be used to understand what are the proclivities of the team. What does the team need in order to trust, so that you're not coming as a leader with a certain trust style. The leader can, or even a coach, because you have to adapt your style to what the person needs. For example, if the team is highly political and you have an integrity style, we just talked about corruption. Everyone's going to run for cover because they're going to be afraid that your transparency is going to expose them. And so it's not about becoming something different. It's about using another skill set to engage. And
It's
then
almost, if you know you're a certain personality style, but you know that somebody else is a different style and their communication preference is more, say, facts and details or more bottom line driven or whatever, it's that adaptation that you're talking about, needing your style to meet their needs. And that's what great leaders do. Let's tie this up. We live in an ever-changing world, an ever-changing workplace. So looking ahead, what cultural traits or systems do you think will be essential for organizations wanting to thrive in unpredictable landscapes and in the future?
I think when I thought about this, I was thinking about which skills leaders need to keep up to date with changes that need to be made within the cultures and systems. And from that perspective, I thought about number one is understanding ecosystems and leading from that perspective, from that understanding, because then it's going to shift how you lead, because now you start to attune to your organization as an ever-changing organism that really needs you to treat change as a constant and lead from that space. And that's a different space than a lot of organizations treat change as an initiative. So it has a starting point and an end point. But the new way of leading requires leaders to understand all these micro changes that are happening so that they're not taking the organization in a direction that they don't intend to. So that's number one. I think, secondly, bringing trust in is essential. The adaptability and innovation and problem solving levels that are needed in a more uncertain environment is going to happen in the same way if trust isn't there. So trust building is a second skill that's needed. And I think there's something that I created also that I call performance leadership versus performance management. And performance leadership has to do with understanding. Performance management is managing a person and their performance. The performance leadership is understanding the company or organization's performance levels, what's impacting at the micro and macro levels at the same time, and understanding how to manage those tensions. It really expands it so that organizations are managing it. And they do that through strategic planning and things like that. But then it needs to be crystallized a bit more.
Right. And I can tell you, I do strategic planning for some of my clients. And when we first start, so much of what they say to me is, last year we had such a great plan and it didn't go anywhere. I said, because you didn't engage your people in the plan. And that's what you're talking about here. And by the way, this performance leadership thing sounds like the next live that you and Nick should do together. That's an awesome concept.
Yeah, I created a system called adaptive organizational performance.
Wow.
And that's around performance leadership. I'm developing it, not finished. I took one or two CEOs through it already, but I'd love to chat about that.
Oh, that'd be great. And bottom line, there will not be a finish point on that because it's adaptive. Hey,
Right.
you're in a good place.
Yeah.
Yvette, this has been fantastic today. Thank you so much.
You're right.
I really appreciate your willingness to share your wisdom with all of us. You have such a wonderful, not just experience level, but it really has transformed into wisdom. It's wisdom for organizations and for leaders. Thank you for sharing that with us.
Thank you. Thank you. I hadn't thought of it that way.
Thank you for listening to Evolve, Reinventing Leadership, Building Freedom Cultures. Learn more about our proprietary trust, leadership, and culture courses and certifications at the IFB Academy. You can check them out at organizationalsoul.learnworlds.com.